Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar using the WISC-V and WIAT-III to diagnose learning disorders. My name is Dr. Melissa Stevens and I will be hosting today's webinar. Before I begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Firstly, please ensure that all other applications on your laptop or computer are closed. This will enable the webinar platform to perform at its best, allowing you a better webinar viewing experience. Since there are a large number of attendees today, you will be muted for the duration of the presentation. Please note that you will still be able to communicate with us and ask questions via the questions panel found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please type your questions in here and I'll endeavour to respond to them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties, simply log out, close all applications and log back in. If this doesn't work, log out, reboot your computer and log back in. Please note this webinar will be recorded. Once the webinar ends, there will be a short survey. Please take a moment to complete it so we can continue to improve our webinars and gain a better understanding of your needs. Let's get to it. So before we start talking about specific learning disorders in particular, let's just have a look and a think about the process of learning that we go through as adults, but also that many of the children that we're working with go through in the classroom. So what is learning? It's basically a process of acquiring information. What are the types of cognitive factors that enable students to show that they know or can do something? So how do they collect, store, sort and retrieve information? How do they receive, perceive, process and remember information? And what other factors might contribute to learning? How they take in information, how children or ourselves put out that information. So in a simple graphic, it would look something like this. We're really, as psychologists, interested in this middle section. It's the process. So all of our assessments, or most of our assessments, will look to measure these particular processes. Yes, we are, of course, interested in inputs and outputs as well, and certainly that is part of the process of assessment. But in terms of understanding learning in a more deeper level, it's these cognitive processing tasks that we're very keen on understanding in greater detail. So if we think about some of the processes, some of the inputs and those outputs, let's think about sensorial motor aspects and learning. So to respond effectively to the demands of the typical classroom, children must be able to encode information and show what they know. And some of the questions that we like to ask our clients when we're doing our comprehensive clinical interview are, for example, is the child able to see the information? So it's really important that if there are some visual issues and disturbances, that the child has any corrective eyewear, for example. Is the child able to hear the information? So what's their hearing acuity like? And again, like with the eyewear, if there are any hearing assistive technologies, are they functioning? Are they turned on? Are they able to hear the information that is being presented? Is the child able to respond in writing? So really looking at what their fine motor skills are like. And is the child able to respond orally? So looking at, particularly in this instance, their language production. What about attention? So in order to perceive, receive, process and remember information, children must of course selectively attend to certain stimuli while ignoring competing or irrelevant stimuli. They must sustain attentional focus for a prolonged period. And if you think about a classroom environment where there are not many breaks, sometimes the teacher is at the front of the class instructing a large group of children, sustained attention can be a battle. It can be hard to maintain that, particularly if there are lots of distractions. Is the child able to shift attentional resources from one activity to another? And can they respond to more than one task simultaneously, what we call divided attention? How about visual spatial and learning? So much of what's presented in schools has either a visual spatial or language basis. And when we're looking particularly at visual spatial or visual perceptual skills, we know these have a large role to play in the development of handwriting skills, as well as fluency in maths and reading. So for example, a student may be able to name individual letters of a word. So they undertake a visual analysis of the letters B, E and D. So individually they recognise these are individual letters, they are in English. So from that perspective they're recognisable. But they might not be able to integrate the letters to say the actual word. So the synthesis aspect of that, which would be bed. And of course then there's language, as we just touched on. So language is the basis for much of the learning that does occur within schools. And we know that children have to understand words and sentences in order to perceive and process the information that's being taught. So this is their receptive language. They obviously must be able to use words to show that they can retrieve information from memory. So looking at their expressive language. And we know from research that early development of reading depends critically on receptive phonological components in particular, as well as the expressive phonological components as well. So we know that language plays a big role in literacy. For speed of information processing, we know that efficient cognitive processing frees up cognitive resources for more complex or higher level tasks. So a weakness in processing speed of, say, routine information may make the task of comprehending novel or non-routine information much more time-consuming and difficult. As an example, if a child names words pretty effortlessly, then they can focus cognitive energy on those higher order comprehension tasks. And if a child can compute fairly fluently, we know that they can focus then on the more challenging mathematical application tasks, for example. And what about working memory and learning? This is probably the area where most of us would be interested in. It's certainly a key area of research. And again, I guess the reason for this is that we know from a lot of that research that many of those learning activities that children are engaged in the classroom actually impose quite a considerable burden on working memory. For example, if we ask a child to hold some information in their mind, so a sentence to be written down or some instructions, for example, while they're doing that, doing this might be quite mentally challenging. So holding down the sentence alone is tough, but then if they're writing it on paper, they've actually got to think about, how do I spell each individual word in that sentence? And so what's going to happen is that's going to place an even bigger burden on their working memory, because they're trying to do two things at once and it's just too mentally challenging. Following lengthy instructions again is the same. They might forget the instructions before the whole sequence is actually complete. And we know again from a lot of this research that poor working memory is very characteristic of children that have lots of different kinds of learning difficulties, whether that be around language specifically, dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, etc. So what is our understanding of a specific learning disorder? So we know, again, we were talking before about learning in particular being the ability to receive, store, process, retrieve and communicate information. And so it's not surprisingly that a specific learning disorder also affects those aspects of cognitive functioning. We know that it's brain-based and it's linked to neurological differences in brain structure. It can manifest in one or more areas of academic achievement. So this is probably one of the key areas that people find confusing about this particular disorder. That is that the sometimes understanding of SLD is that if it affects just one area of functioning, so only reading, for example. But it's better to think of specific learning disorder more around that it is specific to learning in general, and that it actually may, for example, impact not just on reading, but let's say also on written expression. And so you might have a child who has areas of weakness in both of those key areas that are considered to be comorbid, so to speak. And so you can have multiple areas of academic underachievement, even though it is sitting under the broader umbrella term specific learning disorder. So it's really specific to those broader areas or individual specific areas of academic achievement. We know one of the outstanding features of SLD is that it is underachievement that is unexpected. So it's generally not there for other reasons that we might expect. So for example, someone with an intellectual disability who has low cognitive functioning, it might not be unexpected that they would have lower academic achievement. What is more, so we probably wouldn't diagnose an SLD in that instance. Where we would find it unexpected, for example, is when a child is otherwise functioning pretty well, you know, let's say in the average range, and then all of a sudden they have one or multiple areas of academic achievement that are much lower. And we'll get into the specifics of that in a moment, and also look at the differences between some of the historical perspectives that have seen a shift in how we identify these particular disorders. Now, the estimated prevalence is approximately 5 to 15% of students. So we know that SLD has some fairly distinctive features, but how do we identify these students in our classroom? So unfortunately, there has been a little bit of lack of clarity regarding the definitions and distinctions between learning difficulties and disorders, particularly here in Australia. And there have been a large number of terms that have been used to refer to these students. For example, learning disabled, or having a learning disability, a quote slow learner, a learning disabled child, etc. So lots of different definitions with no real clear idea of how does each one differ, how would we identify children into each of these presumably different categories, or are they the same? Now, we've seen over the last 2 decades or so that there have been some significant changes in state and federal legislation in America, and these have helped us to have a clearer understanding of some of the different types of students who fall under the umbrella term of learning difficulties. Advances in cognitive theory and assessment methods, particularly the CHC theory, so for those of you who are familiar with this is the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory, has really helped foster the understanding of cognitive differences between those students with different sort of types of learning difficulties. Again, looking at the difference between an SLD versus a quote slow learner versus an intellectual disability, for example. And prior to this, our understanding of the differences between these groups was fairly limited, and it was basically due to the common methods that were used to try to identify children with specific learning disorder, and they really failed to differentiate between the groups. But we'll come back to that in a moment. So this is probably the most frequently used method of identifying a specific learning disability. And for anyone who was trained in the 80s, 90s, potentially early 2000s, you probably are very familiar with and potentially still using this particular method to assist with your diagnostic process. So the ability achievement discrepancy method uses a statistical method to measure the size of the difference between an individual's cognitive ability and their academic achievement. So generally what this means is that we typically took the child's full-scale IQ, broadly speaking, in a standardised test like the WISC-V, and we compared it to a measure of academic achievement like the WIAT-III, for example. Now, with this method, we were basically looking for an average or above full-scale IQ, so that's our green arrow there, our ability measure, and we were comparing that to a low achievement score, as you can see with the red arrow there. And as I said, it was based on a statistical comparison. The problem with that, however, is that when this method was proposed, federal regulations in both the US and in Australia didn't outline any specific formulas. They didn't provide really any specific numerical values that could be used as a standard measure for this discrepancy criteria. So lots of different states and territories and different countries devised their own criteria for what a severe, mild or moderate ability achievement discrepancy would, what the level would be set at. And that really led to the confusion and the misidentification of children with specific learning difficulties. Some of the other issues is that, of course, as you could see by those arrows, one of the main focuses, or in fact, the only focus from an ability perspective was really IQ. So it focused really on that one global area rather than very specific areas of cognitive deficit. So it really didn't provide information for targeted interventions, for example. And in the previous DSM, the ability achievement discrepancy was actually a criterion for diagnosis of SLD, but this has since been removed in the DSM-5. Now, the RTI model is another aspect or another way of identifying children with specific learning difficulties. And this was developed following realisation that the ability achievement discrepancy model really was only applied, or it really wasn't applied consistently across states or across jurisdictions. And in particular, I mean, that's problematic in itself, but more problematic is the fact that that led to mis- and over-identification of children with specific learning difficulties. So this was a problem. Remember, the estimated prevalence is 5 to 15%. And in some instances, we were seeing significantly more children being identified than what we would expect to find from a prevalence perspective. So the RTI model moved away from defining SLD as a statistical discrepancy and instead tried to conceptualise it as an inadequate response to intervention. So the model consists of 3 tiers, and many of you have seen this. So we have our little pyramid model. I'll show you a picture fairly soon. So tier 1 is looking at quality instruction and screening, and that's pretty much to, the whole classroom. Tier 2 is looking at evidence-based intervention, typically in small groups, and then monitoring those children over time. And our 3rd tier is our individual intervention. And of course, if the student is still failing to respond at this tier, SLD can be diagnosed by default. So it is actually a default diagnosis. And so it looks like this. So we can see that as the amount of intervention and instruction increases and the amount of intervention increases, you'll see that fewer and fewer students fall into each of those different categories. And so at that very top pyramid there, where very few children are getting this intensive intervention, if children don't respond to it, then their default diagnosis is SLD. Now, as you can imagine, there are obviously some problems with this as well. So firstly, it focuses on IQ rather than specific areas of cognitive deficit. Oh, my apologies. It actually is a useful model, but has flaws as a diagnostic solution. So like the ability achievement discrepancy, there aren't really any hard and fast rules for, what this looks like. What legislation stipulates what interventions need to be used. How long do those interventions need to be put in place for? It can, again, like the AAD, result in the misidentification of students. There is confusion around the R, so the response to intervention. So again, how do we measure their response? There were no rules or criteria set around how schools or practitioners might go about this. It also assumes that if a child isn't learning through the intervention provided, then the student must be deficient, not that the intervention is deficient. So it puts the onus on the student, not on the practitioner, the teacher or the school. And again, while AAD had numerous flaws, which we outlined earlier, the mathematics behind the model could be understood. With response to intervention, there are no mathematics behind it. And so there's a real issue when we're not basing it on foundational information that we provide or generate from our assessments. And because it is a diagnosis by default, response to intervention only fails to distinguish between different groups under the learning difficulties umbrella, and we really don't have any further information around what their cognitive skills might be, for example. So it might not identify children who actually have some reasonable average or above average cognitive skills that might do okay in response to that intervention, but actually still have a specific learning disorder. So again, that real issue with the previous 2 models, the ability achievement discrepancy and the response to intervention, is really around the fact that we just are not accurately identifying children who have this particular concern. Now, most of you are probably fairly well up to date with the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, but for those of you who aren't, let's have a quick look at what they are. These have been taken out directly from the manual and cut down, so please do refer back to the actual DSM-5 for further information. So the first thing you'll notice is that the specific learning disorder category now sits under neurodevelopmental disorders. The first criteria is that the child will have difficult, or adult for those working in the adult area, but the individual will have difficulties learning and using academic skills as indicated by the presence of at least one of the following symptoms, and those symptoms must have persisted for at least 6 months, despite provision of interventions that target those difficulties. So some of the areas that you might be interested in measuring would be word reading, so is it inaccurate or slow and effortful? Does the individual understand the meaning of what they've just read? Does it relate to spelling or written expression, or mastering number sense and mathematical reasoning? The second criterion is that the affected academic skills are substantially and quantifiably below those expected for the individual's chronological age and causes significant interference with academic or occupational performance or with activities of daily living. Now, there is no comparison to FSIQ at this point, as you'll notice, as we saw in the DSM-4, but there is an indication of when we say quantifiably and substantially, what do the individuals who put this particular criteria together mean? So in the DSM-5, it stipulates that you are required to have psychometric evidence from an individually administered, psychometrically sound and culturally appropriate test of academic achievement that is norm referenced, and the WIAT does that. And for the greatest diagnostic certainty, scores on one or more standardised tests or subtests within an academic domain must be at least 1.5 standard deviations below the mean for the child's age. And this translates to a standard score of about 78 or less, which is below the 7th percentile. And you can see, read more information on page 69 of the DSM-5 if you're interested. Criterion C is that the learning difficulties begin during school age years and are not better accounted for by intellectual disabilities, uncorrected visual or auditory acuity, other mental or neurological disorders, etc. So we've really got to do a good differential diagnosis to ensure that we have ruled out all those other things that might be contributing to this, quote, underachievement. And in particular, if you're reading through pages 73 to 74, you'll actually see a list of differential diagnoses. They include normal variations in academic attainment, intellectual disability is one of those, learning disorders due to a neurological or sensory disorder. So again, thinking about that, what we've talked about at the start, the process of learning, any other neurocognitive disorders, ADHD. Now, interestingly enough, ADHD is highly comorbid with learning disorders. So you may have both, but you certainly need to do still that due diligence of differential diagnosis to ensure that there is the presence of both and that the learning disorder or learning difficulties in this instance are not directly attributable to the ADHD specifically. And of course, psychotic disorders. So the 4 diagnostic criteria are to be met based on clinical synthesis of the individual's history, so developmental, medical, family and educational, their school reports and a psychoeducational assessment. And there are some specifiers which include impairment in reading, otherwise known as dyslexia, written expression and or mathematics, or what we have come to call dyscalculia, as well as severity. So I'm going to talk now about the patterns of strengths and weaknesses, and some of you will have heard of this term before, some of you might have even given this a go, or you attempted it and just thought, you know, it's too confusing, I don't understand it. And so the question here is, this is a new approach. Can we use this as a way of better and more accurately identifying children who have these difficulties that would fit the criteria for SLD? So before we get to that, I do just want to draw attention to some of the clinical validity studies that were conducted with children who completed both the WIAT and also the WISC-V. And so we saw in the WISC-V in particular that when we had a group of children who had an SLD in reading in particular, that when we compared them to their control group, they had lower working memory, they had a lower general fund of knowledge, in particular in VCI. They had lower rapid automatic naming, so both literacy and quantitative, so that's, you know, related to reading and maths. And the mixed reading and writing group also had lower FRI scores, so the fluid reasoning also came out with a mixed reading writing group. When we looked at children who had SLD in relation to mathematics, again, when compared to the control group, they had low quantitative reasoning. That's probably not unexpected given the name of that index. It's looking at the quantitative reasoning or mathematical ability. They also showed lower working memory scores. They had lower nonverbal and visual spatial scores, which probably is related to the visual nature of understanding mathematics. And they had lower processing speed scores as well. So keep that in mind for a moment, because we're going to come back to that once we better understand what this PSW process is. So it's a little bit like a merge of the previous two models, the AADs, the Ability Achievement Discrepancy, and the RTI, or Response to Intervention model. But it really is looking more focused at the assessment and the specific abilities and processes that are needed at that top level of intervention, that Tier 3 level. And we're going to be using standardized measures to identify those children rather than just simply, you know, picking them by default because of their lack of response to that intervention. Because remember, again, sometimes it might have been the intervention that wasn't overly effective. And so by examining a student's unique pattern of cognitive and academic strengths and weaknesses, it can provide us with some insight into why certain methods of instruction have failed and, you know, maybe find an alternative intervention. So let's look at, you know, some accommodations or some compensatory strategies, and these might be more effective. And so this model really is research-based, which is brilliant. And it was developed, as I said, due to the need to have a more reliable and valid method. And it really, hopefully, will allow us to better distinguish between children who have specific learning disorder versus children who are underachieving for a range of different reasons. And some of the methods used within it are based on a couple of components or assumptions. So the first one is that the cognitive and academic weaknesses are empirically related. Generally, children have above or above average overall cognitive ability, particularly when you remove those cognitive weaknesses. And there is a statistical and clinically meaningful difference between overall cognitive ability and those areas of cognitive and academic weakness. It does require the identification of a processing weakness from the WISC-V. And we identify or rule out a relative processing weakness as contributing to a child's their achievement weakness as a critical step toward differentiating between children who have an SLD and underachievement for other reasons. So a child with an SLD requires individualised instruction that is responsive to his or her processing strengths and their weaknesses. In contrast, a child who might be underachieving for other reasons might actually benefit from individualised instruction, but might also respond to more general instruction at a greater intensity. So again, it's important, given using RTI only is not sufficient for diagnosing SLD, but it can still form part of the process in better helping these children to learn moving forward. Now, there are a couple of different theories that you can read up on that are prominent in the research. I'm not going to talk specifically about all of them, but these are just a range of probably the most commonly referenced approaches in terms of this particular patterns of strengths and weaknesses approach. Now, regardless of which model you might want to focus on, they really all have these key commonalities. So the first thing we need to do in this process is to rule out exclusionary factors as part of the definition of a learning disability. So we're going to rule out those input and output issues. So for example, if the child is unable to hear the information that's being presented, then obviously it's not an SLD, it's a hearing problem. Yes, there may be secondary learning difficulties, of course we would expect that, but in that instance, it's not deemed a specific learning disorder, because one would assume that if you can fix the hearing problem, then the learning would pick up and improve thereafter. They also assume that, or have in common, the identification of a cognitive processing weakness that is related to the achievement weakness, and we'll talk about this more in a moment. And they also all identify one or more areas of strength that are unrelated to the achievement weakness, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more too. So what we do is we do some score comparisons and we look for significant differences, or what they call discrepancies, in the model to meet the criteria for SLD. So there are two different score comparisons that are made, and these are all done electronically. By the way, you just have to input each of these individual aspects. So there is a processing strength that is typically derived from the WISC, and we compare that to an achievement weakness, for example, reading. So a processing strength in that instance might be the individual's fluid reasoning ability that we wouldn't expect to be impacted on by their reading disability. Then the second comparison takes that same processing strength, let's say again fluid reasoning, and we compare it to a processing weakness, which might be, for example, working memory, that we know a lot of children with SLD have. And what we're really looking for is that there is a discrepancy between those at a statistical level, but also is there a consistency between the achievement weakness and the processing weakness. Again, this is part of that rationale for identifying children with a specific learning difficulty. Now, the score comparisons are evaluated using a simple difference method rather than a regression method. And if the comparisons are not statistically significant, the child does not demonstrate a pattern consistent with SLD. However, practitioners should not rely only on the statistical comparisons. They must rely upon clinical judgment and a very careful evaluation of multiple sources of information when we're diagnosing SLDs. So this is not the be-all and end-all. It provides a framework and a way to do a fairly robust and reliable comparison between the child's current functioning, both at the ability and the achievement level. So let's look specifically with the WISC-V, what this looks like. So step one, we select the subtest or the composite score from the WISC-V that corresponds to the primary achievement weakness. Oh, apologies, that's from the WIAT. Step two is we select the WISC-V standard score that represents the processing weakness. And step three is we select the WISC-V standard score that represents the processing strength. So step one is our WIAT. This is the key area that we feel is the child's academic achievement weakness. Steps 2 and 3 then utilise the WISC-V both for the processing weakness and for the processing strength. So 3 steps, that's it. And I'll show you what that looks like on our electronic Q Global interface. So as I mentioned, we take the WIAT-III, we look at the achievement weakness, let's say reading again, and it might be an individual subtest like pseudo word decoding, or it could be the entire reading composite, for example. And typically we would be considering scores that are less than 85. Again, if you're thinking about the DSM-5, they were indicating that for the greatest diagnostic certainty, we'd really be looking at scores in academic achievement of 78 or below. So the system will provide you with a flag or a warning if you choose an academic achievement weakness area above 85. And we do indicate that you should probably examine some of the subtest variability within the WIAT if you are selecting a composite score, just because sometimes when there is great variability at the subtest level, it can kind of even out those and you don't get the full picture at the composite level. So if you are finding that, so you look at the total reading score, for example, but you see that there's quite a lot of variance underneath that score, then you might be better off to use the individual subtest. Step 2, so we select the WISC-V processing weakness score. Again, this is generally associated with the achievement weakness. So for reading, we might choose VCI, for example, because we know children have lower fund of information or fund of knowledge. We might choose working memory or even processing speed. We know that they're quite commonly lower in children with SLD. Again, we would examine the subtest variability within the WISC-V, and it's preferable but not always necessary to use a different standard score if there are large underlying discrepancies for that index. Step 3, we select the WISC-V processing strength score, and this processing strength is not typically related to the achievement weakness. So if we had word reading or pseudo-word decoding, perhaps total reading as our achievement weakness, we have working memory, let's say, as our processing weakness, then our processing strength might be fluid reasoning or visual spatial. And so we examine again subtest variability, and like the previous one, we might indicate that actually a different processing strength might be better if there is vast underlying discrepancy in those subtests. Now, we do know from research that the recommendation is that at this point for the processing strength, and I'll show you a visual representation to really drive this home in a moment, the recommendation here is to avoid using indices like working memory, processing speed, auditory working memory, etc., as these really haven't been well accepted as processing strengths. So we're really looking at things like verbal comprehension, fluid reasoning, visual spatial index, etc. And then our final step is if the child is underachieving in more than one area, then you conduct the analysis for each of those areas of weakness. And what's really important at this point is that you select the processing strength and the weakness carefully each time you do it. And the reason for that is it all is in relation to that academic weakness that you have selected. So just go back, repeat the process, but pay attention to the indices that you're selecting. So as I mentioned, I'm going to show you what this looks like on Q Global. And you can also conduct this through Q Interactive. And I'll show you both of those. So this is our Q Global option. You can see one of the first things we need to do is select age-based norms. Now, a lot of us for the WIAT-III will select year-based because we are reporting back to teachers, for example, and it makes more sense. If the child's in grade 1, they're in grade 1. It doesn't matter if they're age 6, 7 or 8. But because we're doing a comparison to the WISC-V, which does not have year-based norms, you must select age-based for this comparison. And once you do that, it will allow you to, my apologies, I went the wrong way, to select these two options. You can see we've got our patterns of strengths and weaknesses model, and you can also do the ability achievement discrepancy analysis if you still wish. So it takes us to, or we scroll down in this instance to the next panel below, and we're choosing the WISC-V in this instance, and our processing strength for the WISC-V might be VCI, for example, with a score of 105 in this instance, and our processing weakness might be PSI, let's say. Now, in this instance, PSI was 95, and there's a little prompt to say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't use a score above 85 as a weakness because it's certainly not acceptable in all settings. That's referencing the US legislation, of course, but a score of 95 in the average range is probably not considered a weakness with a VCI at 105. So it's probably not a useful index to use in this instance. Now, we can select from a range of different WIAT composites and subtests. And in this instance, we've done a maths one. And you can, again, select for the AAD which score comparison you want to make, whether you want to base it on the full scale IQ or if you have reason to base it on one of the other indices. Now, in Q Interactive, that's our iPad-based assessment. The process is the same. A little bit different, however, so we still have to select age-based norms and we tick the box to include in the report either the patterns of strengths and weaknesses and or the ability achievement discrepancy. And then the processing is exactly the same. So before we see this actually in a model with the statistical comparisons and analyses completed, let's just have a comparison of these approach. approaches, apologies. So for the patterns of strengths and weaknesses, our primary index scores, or some of the ancillary and complementary scores, are used as measures of processing strengths and weaknesses. This is in comparison to the ability achievement discrepancy, which ultimately use the full scale IQ unless there was some compelling clinical reason to choose one of the other ones. So for example, there was a visual, a motor, language problem, working memory, processing speed issues related to some other clinical condition, which is kind of problematic in itself, remembering what our differential diagnoses are. We're really meant to be ruling out all those input and output aspects before we make the diagnosis. This actually says, well, in fact, if they exist, just use one of the other indices and you can go ahead and do the analysis, which is kind of against the diagnostic criteria. For the patterns of strengths and weaknesses, we use 2 score comparisons versus a single comparison at the AAD level. And statistical evidence of a processing weakness is an essential requirement of the patterns of strengths and weaknesses, whereas for the ability achievement discrepancy, no statistical evidence of a processing weakness was necessary. We also know that from US research, and in particular using data from the previous edition of these assessments, which were the WISC-IV and the WIAT-III, the goal was to ascertain the percentage of children who were previously classified as having a specific learning disorder who would meet the criteria for a patterns of strengths and weaknesses model. So all of their scores were run through the analysis, and they found that only 63% of nearly 150 children who were previously identified as having a specific learning difficulty actually met the patterns of strengths and weaknesses model. Only 63%. And so utilising psychometric comparisons only, a slightly smaller number met the criteria of the patterns of strengths and weaknesses model than just using the ability achievement discrepancy. Now, of course, we don't recommend you only use one or both independently. Remember, I said before, it is really imperative that clinicians look to the rest of the information that is available to them before diagnosing SLD. It is not just reliant on a statistical model, although that helps to confirm our hypotheses, but we do have to use some clinical judgment in this process. But this was just showing you the differences in terms of perhaps previously using the AAD, we might have been over-identifying individuals with a specific learning difficulty, and that in fact maybe they didn't have an SLD, but they might have been underachieving for other reasons. So again, the PSW is intended to help you generate hypotheses. It is not intended for use in isolation, as I mentioned. We do want to make sure that we're considering all the information, including their history, the types of observations, any information we can gain from RTI. So if the child hasn't gone through any intervention, we actually can't make the diagnosis according to DSM. Any other test results, any other information from teachers or parents, other family members, school reports, etc. And any unusual characteristics or disabilities, so comorbid disabilities in particular. So let's look at some case examples in our last 15 minutes, and we'll hopefully have some time to get to some questions. So this is what it actually looks like from the printout that you get from either Q Global or Q Interactive. So in this instance, we have selected the achievement weakness as being one of the mathematical subtests, being numerical operations. You can see that on the bottom left. The processing strength of the WISC-V is verbal comprehension, and the processing weakness also from the WISC-V is working memory. And you can see that there will be 2 analyses run, one between the WIAT achievement weakness and the WISC processing strength. And the question here, are they discrepant? The answer is yes. You can see that next to A on the left. And on the right, we're looking at whether the processing weakness is also discrepant from the processing strength, and in this instance it is. The final, you can see at the bottom in the middle dotted line, refers to, is there a reason to have or not is there a reason, do these 2 aspects of functioning, that is their achievement weakness and their processing weakness, do they kind of go together? Do they make sense in terms of a child who is struggling with numerical operations, would we expect them to have poor working memory? And here the answer is yes. Whereas if I had numerical operations and as the processing weakness something more related to mathematics, then it wouldn't meet that particular criteria, although that is not essential in the comparison, but it's worthwhile doing it again because what we're trying to do is to identify children who have SLD versus children who are underachieving for other reasons. Here is another one with word reading as being our achievement weakness. So in this instance, our processing strength is VSI because we might expect VCI to be lower, for example, and our processing weakness, in fact, for that reason is verbal comprehension. And in this instance, again, we get two discrepant results. Now you also get a nice little table that gives you the critical value, whether it is significant, again, populated on the table, and whether or not it supports a diagnosis of SLD as a hypothesis. So remember, I'm going to keep reiterating this, the patterns of strengths and weaknesses model is intended to help us to generate hypotheses regarding clinical diagnoses. But it should always be used in a comprehensive evaluation that incorporates multiple sources of information and takes into consideration intervention. So let's see another one. Here we have maths fluency compared to a processing strength of fluid reasoning and a processing weakness of processing speed. Now in this instance, there are no discrepant differences between the processing strength and academic weakness or the processing strength and processing weakness. So this wouldn't support our hypothesis for SLD. Now, if we looked at that same individual, but we only ran an ability achievement discrepancy, we get very different results. In fact, here we would be indicating that actually this child does have an SLD with a base rate of less than 5%. So it's interesting here that if we take the processing weakness into account, it actually no longer supports that hypothesis. And this would be one of those children who has potentially been misdiagnosed previously, but actually might be underachieving for other reasons, not because they have a specific learning disorder. It's interesting also to note, you'll see here that the scores, the actual WIAT scores for these maths tasks is 85. Now remember in the DSM-5, the current DSM-5, that the recommendation for the greatest diagnostic certainty is to use scores that are below 78. So actually it would be a reasonably hard sell, I think, in today's day and age to use a score of 85. Now, of course, that might be different if the processing strengths are significantly higher. So if we're looking at children who are in the high average or gifted range, then of course we would have reason to believe that perhaps their achievement scores would be a lot higher due to things like effort, other compensatory strategies, etc. But in this instance where we have average scores, you know, we probably wouldn't be looking at a diagnosis just at looking at the numbers alone. So let's have a look at a case study, and here I'm actually going to use one from a former colleague of mine and a very brilliant educational and developmental psychologist named Madeline Armstrong. And this was a case that we're just going to call her Lily. So Madeline saw Lily in her private practice, and at the time of assessment, Lily was 8 years and 2 months old. She was in grade 3 at the time and was attending mainstream school. She was born in Australia at full term. She reached her developmental milestones at age expected times. There didn't appear to be any reports of regression in skills. There certainly wasn't any history of major illnesses or injuries. There were no previous assessments with either educational or other allied health professionals. And the concerns were raised when Lily was in prep, but no concerns were raised from the teachers in grade 1 or 2, although she had participated in reading recovery in grade 1 due to that concern raised in prep. She was not on an individual learning plan at the time of assessment, and Lily reported that she didn't really enjoy school. She found the schoolwork to be quite hard, and she didn't feel like she could ask her teacher for help. So the question was, you know, is Lily experiencing or does she have a specific learning disorder? So let's have a look at the results. So this is her WISC-V profile, and you can see that pretty much everything except for processing speed is in the average range. So 90s and above across the board, FSIQ is just out of the average range, and then processing speed there sitting at 80. These are her WIAT scores, and again you can see that they're all mostly in the 80s and a few up into the 90s. There is one in particular that is quite a lot lower, and that might be, you know, a flag for us, particularly in light of the DSM-5 criteria, which is word reading at 78. So what we do is we plug it into Q Global, and the first thing we'll do is pick out word reading, which was that lowest score of 78. In this instance, again, we want a processing strength that is not related to word reading, so visual spatial, which was also her highest score, was selected, and the processing speed index was chosen as the processing weakness with a score of 80. Now, what you'll actually notice, and I'm just going to flick to the next slide, is that there was one comparison that said, yep, you know, this supports the SLD hypothesis, but the processing strength and processing weakness comparison, that is the difference between BSI and PSI, was actually not statistically significant. Now, if an ability achievement discrepancy had been run, thankfully, in this instance, this is not always the case. Actually, my apologies. In this instance, it did populate as a significant difference using just the full scale IQ. So you can see word reading flagged, so that's the third one down. And the second last one in that middle section, oral reading fluency, was also significantly different. Although you can see the base rate for that one was pretty high. You know, 25% of the, probably not something we'd write home about. And there's a couple of other ones at the composite level for both reading comprehension and fluency, as well as mathematics. But again, you know, reasonably high base rates. But that word reading, looking at what the predicted score might have been, was actually less than 10% for a base rate. So in the old days, we would have looked at that and we would have said, you know what, let's diagnose Lily with an SLD. Now, interestingly enough, using the PSW, the decision was made to not diagnose a specific learning disorder. And that was based on, though, the lack of statistical comparison. The other issue with Lily's case was that the criteria for intervention was also not met. Reading recovery, as we know, does not count as evidence-based explicit instruction for reading difficulties. So it might have been a different case if Lily had undergone more explicit instruction, that perhaps in this instance, and given the other information, if that was slightly different, that she'd been struggling, there were other issues that she was experiencing in her learning, that this diagnosis might have been a little bit different. But in this case, reading recovery, we wouldn't count as being or meeting the criteria. And there was only one statistical comparison that was significant. Now, given Lily's processing speed weakness, we would actually expect that some areas of academic would be impaired. Behavioural assessments might also reveal other aspects, and in fact they did. So there was elevated anxiety that Lily was experiencing, and this was seen to potentially also be impacting on her school performance. So some of the recommendations that were made were for additional tutoring, specifically targeting her letter sound knowledge and reading that she was having difficulties with. An IEP or ILP was also recommended in terms of monitoring progress and goals at school. And there was also a recommendation to make more reasonable adjustments within the classroom to assist with those processing speed weaknesses. So allow Lily some more time to complete her work, reduce the quality of her work in favour of, the quantity of her work in favour of quality, limit copying activities and so forth. So before I get to questions, let's just have a quick look at our pricing. So there is more information about the patterns of strengths and weaknesses in the WIAT-III Examiner's Manual. You can also purchase the Essentials book, which takes you through the process, not just for the WIAT-III, but also for the Kaufman test of educational achievement as well. If you're using Q Global or you want to use Q Global, you can purchase just individual score reports for $3 each, and that's for the WIAT. So the patterns of strengths and weaknesses and the ability achievement discrepancy are driven by the WIAT report, or you can purchase an unlimited use annual license for $45, or if you're using Q Interactive, as I mentioned, it is included in the cost of that assessment. The other thing that you get from the reports, from both platforms, is a skills analysis report if you wish to generate this. I find this particularly helpful. I'm not a teacher by trade, and so I find it helpful to be able to provide information to the teachers I'm reporting to in relation to where the errors occurred or where the major difficulties that the child experienced. So irrespective of whether or not the child has a specific learning disorder, this type of information I think is really powerful. So for example, we can have a look at the analysis here, and we can look at the columns on the right-hand side, which is looking at the percentage of skills or items that the child got correct. And you can see that actually she's really struggling with a few of these skills. For example, single long vowels, the schwa vowel sounds, and consonant blends or clusters. And I find that really powerful to be able to say to teachers who are much more aware of what these skills are, when they should be developed, how to teach them and improve them, to be able to say these are the specific areas that she was really struggling with. And so they form the basis of your intervention or some recommendations. The other thing you can do is also look at some intervention goal statements. So these give you short-term objectives as well as some potential annual goals, and these are again based on the specific item where the child showed errors. In this instance, we're looking at item 9 and 10 on word reading, which is targeting the consonant digraphs. The other book that you might be interested in reading is this Essentials book, which is specifically looking at those learning disability identification. And at that point, let me just have a quick look whether or not we have any questions, and we might answer those. Okay. So do you think a student with low IQ, say in the 70s or 80s, would be considered to have SLD? Thanks, Bree. That's probably a really tough one. Generally speaking, I guess it depends on what your hypothesis is. So we know that the two tasks are related. That is, there is a reasonable consistency between IQ and academic achievement. So for me personally, I would suspect, particularly with someone who is functioning in their 70s, let's say, that if their academic achievement was also within that range, I'm not considering that to be specific. So if again, we're thinking of the name of the diagnosis, specific learning disorder, that kind of implies to me that there's some cognitive issues going on for that child. And in that case, I'd be looking at it saying, more broadly speaking, the child is having difficulties, both cognitively and academically, but I wouldn't be diagnosing an SLD. Now, you may find other practitioners and other clinicians who would disagree with me on that. But from my perspective, I don't think we've really done our due diligence in terms of differential diagnosis. It's a real shame, I think, that the DSM-5 removed IQ. I understand why they did, although in fact, if you look at the online printout of SLD, so from the AP, I think it's AMA or APA, the American Psychiatric Association, APA, they actually still mention in their fact sheet IQ in criterion B. So for me personally, as I mentioned, I just think there's something else that is explaining or better describing the difficulties the child's experiencing in that instance, which is cognition, and therefore it doesn't really meet that criteria of, quote, specific. You know, it's a more broader or global difficulty in that instance. Yes, they're going to struggle to learn. I'm certainly not suggesting they won't, but it's for other reasons. Our next question, so comment on the fact that DSM uses chronological age. So gifted children may be performing at chronological age, but still be performing much lower than their potential. Yeah, I guess it's a little bit like the previous one, Elaine, where I guess when they removed IQ, they had to include chronological age. And so in that instance, I think we just have to make do. So a little bit like what I was saying before with gifted children, that we have to make some exceptions for them in terms of doing our comparisons. And part of that is looking at not necessarily their potential per se, but kind of factoring that in still. So again, it's sort of going back to, well, what does the whole pattern, what does the story, what does the whole picture look like? So for children who have, you know, exceptional ability, but their academic achievement's not quite up to scratch, I'd be looking at it and saying, well, you know what, if they're in grade 2 and they're performing at grade 2 work, I probably wouldn't be comfortable diagnosing an SLD in that instance, because if they've only had access to exposure of the information and the types of tasks and abilities or areas of achievement for a grade 2, then I'd sort of say, well, you know, that's not unexpected. It'd be a little bit different, however, if they had been exposed to grade 3, 4, 5 work, given that, quote, potential. And at that level, they were, quote, underperforming. So I think we did, and again, I think chronological age is a real shame there, because it really should include educational achievement too, I think, or educational opportunities. Because if they just haven't had exposure to the curriculum, and remember the WIAT, the KT, our academic achievement tests are based on what we learn in a classroom, then it might just be that they haven't got that knowledge to begin with. So they're not necessarily struggling in that instance, they just don't have the knowledge. As I said, a little bit different if they've had the knowledge, they've been exposed to it, and they're still struggling, then yes, I think in that instance, Elaine, it would certainly support an SLD diagnosis. The next one is in regard to DSM-5, the issue of differential diagnosis for SLD. So does ASD need to be ruled out, or can it co-occur? Good question. And I don't want to slaughter your name, but I think it's Alfaya. In that instance, it would be comorbid. So there is, it's not called out. I guess, well, in a sense it is. It's under the other neurological concerns. Much like ADHD, you'll probably find a high comorbidity of both of these disorders, but we still have to do our due diligence and make sure we're appropriately identifying both and indicating that. Obviously, you know, in the case of, let's say, ADHD, or even ASD, if we're using that as an example, let's say for ADHD, primarily attention, ASD, we're saying it's primarily some language influences. If the child is underachieving, they're not learning, they're struggling to read or write or do mathematics because of those aspects of that primary diagnosis, that is either the attention or the language, then we're not going to make it a comorbid diagnosis. We really want to say that actually, yes, we know they're going to struggle because of the attention and or language. We know that there will be learning difficulties, but if it's above and beyond that, and there are other patterns, there are other things indicating that it's more than just that aspect of that primary disorder, then yes, we'll make a comorbid diagnosis. Good question. The second question, follow-up. So what assessment tools are recommended for adults? Yes, you can do the WACE. You can also use that for college students as well. So the WACE starts from age 16, and the WIAT is normed up to 50-11, so 50 years and 11 months, so you can do those comparisons. Anne had a question, how can this be done when not using Q Global? So unfortunately, there is no option to do hand scoring. It is only available electronically. Wendy asked for some evidence-based interventions for reading and maths. What we might do is we'll put some links, if we can, on our website and in your recording. So there'll be a link to the handouts, which you can also download from the right-hand panel, and we'll provide some intervention, not from Pearson, but from other sources that we find to be quite useful and trustworthy. Anna has a question about costs. I think I covered that in the slides. Any recommendations for tests for adults? Thanks, Craig. I think I've answered that one as well. Belinda, you've just asked, can we have a copy of the slides? Yes, you can, and we will send them out to you in an email. And I think all the rest pretty much look like double ups. Is it possible to do, again, Brooks asked the same question, can we do it manually? I've answered that one. That's it, I think. If I haven't answered your specific question, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, what we will do is we will end on that note. Now, before everyone drops off, I will just let you be aware of a promotion that's coming up to support National Psychology Week, which is the 16th to the 19th of November 2019, and we are providing free freight for all online orders. So have a look out in your inboxes for an email that speaks to that. Otherwise, I wish you a great day and thank you for attending. So for anyone who's left on the line, I would like to ask you that as you exit to please complete the survey. You can put additional questions in there and I will get back to you. But otherwise, as I mentioned, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.